Okay, the plan for today, a brief introduction, very brief. A discussion about the title and the author and the arrangement, a little bit longer. The location of Genesis, just brief. So that you know some important points about Genesis, particular with modern scholarship. We'll look at names of God in Genesis because it's important. We'll talk about the genealogies in Genesis because it will matter. I want you to see 10 anticipations of eternity in Genesis because it so connects with the book of Revelation. Tim and I were talking about this. In Genesis, we see paradise lost. We see the entire cosmos plunged into sin, plunged into chaos because of man's sin. In the Revelation, we see all of that reversed. And so I'll show you a document I created, 10 Anticipations of Eternity in Genesis. We'll then read Genesis 1 through 2, 3 in its entirety. The creation narrative, week 1 discussion. Then we'll go back to 1:1 and begin going word by word by word through Genesis. So that's the plan for today. So a brief introduction, that's where we start. I said it in my prayer, the book of Genesis is one of the most important books ever written. It not only serves as an introduction to the Old Testament, which of course it does, but it serves as an introduction to the entire Bible. There are many things we would have no idea why that is so, why it is like that. Why is this like this, were it not for Genesis telling us the reason that it's like that? And I'll give you some of those examples as we go. But again, we are coming to one of the most fascinating books in the entire Bible, and I think we'll have a wonderful time. Okay, title, author, and arrangement. So the English title Genesis comes from the Greek translation in the Pentateuch, that stands for 5 books, the first 5 books of the Bible. The Greek translation of the Pentateuch, which gives Genesis the name Origins. We just followed that name, beginnings. This is an appropriate title for the book of Genesis because it gives us a number of beginnings. You may not have ever realized it, but if you just start reading Genesis with that in mind, you will see beginning after beginning, origin after origin, start after start. And you're thinking, Rich, what are you talking about? Well, at our webpage, under miscellaneous documents, I uploaded a document called 10 Genesis, 10 Origins in Genesis. You can see the first couple, the Genesis of the universe, the Genesis of life, the Genesis of mankind. But I want to focus on 2 just in a brief discussion before I run off and leave the other 8 for you if you're interested to download the document and look at. And again, these are just 10. There are many more. I was just kind of having a fascination with the idea, and so pull 10 out real quick. But I do want you to look at Genesis, the Genesis of death. Genesis 2:16 and 17 says this. And Yahweh, God, commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Science can explain to us what death is. They can explain the processes. They can explain the degradation that is occurring in the DNA. They can't answer the question, why? Is it a requirement that biological life dies? Was that somehow built in the program? And I would argue absolutely not. Death is a result of sin. And modern science cannot answer that question. The Bible answers it rather vividly. In the day you eat of that tree, one command, you shall surely die. It's in the book of Genesis that we find the origin of death and the explanation of why everything, every living thing, trees, whatever, dies sooner or later. But then also the genesis of the nation of Israel. Let me read it to you. Now Yahweh said to Abram, Go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The Abrahamic covenant, we've talked about it over and over again. Hallelujah. But let's be honest. Without Genesis, we would have no idea why when we hit Exodus, Yahweh, the creator of all things, has an interest in these Hebrew slaves. Of all the slaves on the planet, why does he take an interest in the slaves in Egypt, these Hebrew slaves, these Israelite slaves? because of Abraham, because of Isaac, because of Jacob, because of the covenant that he has made with those people when he called Abraham out of Ur of Chaldees unto himself. And we would hit Exodus and go, this makes no sense. God just looks down from heaven and sees a group of people locked up in Egypt, and all of a sudden he starts moving heaven and earth to get them out of there. It's Genesis that explains everything about the nation of Israel and brings sense to it that we would not have otherwise. That's just 2 of the examples of the 10 that are on the document. So the author, like all canon, like all the sacred canon, the book of Genesis was written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Peter said it this way, 2 Peter 1:20 and 21, knowing this first, that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. For the prophecy came not in old time by the will of men, but holy men of God spoke as they were moved, as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. And so as we look at Genesis, the first thing you should see is it is a book written by a human author as God moved in his life to write. In fact, we could go even further. There's an end game to why God would even do that. We will quote 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. All scriptures given by inspiration of God, God breathed, profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, instruction in righteousness, that the man and the woman of God may be perfect, complete, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. We have Genesis because it's to teach us, it's to guide us, it's to help us understand the God who we love and serve, and Christ who died for our sins. Now, as I tell you all this, and I talk about the human author moved by the Spirit of God, you're sitting there going, yeah, but let's talk, who's the human author? Well, traditionally, Genesis, like the rest of the Pentateuch, 5 books, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, has been ascribed to Moses. The other 4 books of the Pentateuch relate to Moses' life all the way from Egypt to the border of Canaan. They take his life, all 4 of those books. What's interesting, the phrase the Lord spoke to Moses, Tim, used 104 times in the Pentateuch. 104 times. God is speaking directly to Moses. 4 times, and you have them in your notes, the phrase is used, Moses wrote. So God was speaking, Moses was writing. At least 4 times, God is saying things to Moses, and Moses is recording those things. So until very recently, scholars believe that Moses wrote Genesis. In fact, it's quite natural to believe that he wrote Genesis. It's the lead-in book to the 4 books that he absolutely wrote. They're all about his life. But I would say it's more than natural. As Jesus was on the road to Emmaus, here's what the Bible tells us. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Beginning with Moses, beginning with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the prophets, he began to unwind that, hey, this is about me. And hey, there's a deeper story here. It's about me. Hey, this story right here, it's true, it really happened. David did really take down Goliath, but the story is really about me taking down your Goliath. I believe he began to unravel the Old Testament and show how it was just littered with pictures and stories and early types of him. Further along in the story, Jesus said this. Then he said to them, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms might be fulfilled. So I would argue it's more than natural to believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, all 5 books. Jesus seems to imply that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, all 5 books. Yeah, Chuck. Oh, I'm gone again? Okay, am I back? Okay, it's just, let me see if I can get it straight again. Okay, so now the question in your mind is, okay, Rich, if Moses, I got it, Moses wrote the Pentateuch, he wrote all the first 5 books, where did he get the information? Right? That's the question that you have on your mind. Where did Moses get the information? Okay, 3 theories. Number 1, Moses received it by direct revelation. Now, let's be honest. Let's talk through this. Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. He came down with the 10 commandments. There was a sex party going on, worshiping the golden calf. He threw down the stones, the law now being broken already. It no more been delivered, and it's already broken. And then he went back on the mountain 40 more days and 40 nights with God. Equally, Moses was multiple times in the tent of meeting with God. It's easy to believe that God could have, over all of these days, which were in excess of 80, told Moses the history, explained to Moses everything that went on with the nation of Israel before Moses. 50 chapters worth of data. It's a lot of revelation, but it is possible. That's not what I think. But some people think that, and I would argue that's possible. We can't go, that's not possible. That's very possible. If you got 80 days with God just there, you can handle it. He received it, passed down from generation to generation by oral tradition. Okay? Now you're thinking, okay, oral tradition, 50 chapters, how is that possible? That seems a little stretched for the imagination. Not really. Here's what the genealogies look like if you were to map them out. If you look at Adam, who lived 930 years, he was alive while his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, his great-great-grandson, his great-great-great-grandson, his great-great-great-great-grandson, and even his great-great-great-great, I don't know how many greats I have, 5 grandson was still alive. So the guy who saw the events would have been able to check the stories as people were telling them and going, no, I was there. That's not what happened, as they told the story. So although I don't believe oral tradition is the ultimate and final answer, I do believe some of it was oral tradition, more than likely, just as some of it was divine revelation, like the 10 Commandments were definitely divine revelation. But then there's one more possibility. And that's thirdly, that Moses took actual written records that had been written and collected and passed down. And with the Holy Spirit of God guiding the production of the final product, he produced the book Genesis. What I believe is a culmination of all three of those. No doubt some things were oral tradition, passed down. He recorded those things. No doubt some things were revealed by God, like the 10 Commandments. Those were divinely revealed to Moses by God. No doubt other things were as well. But then equally, I think there were documents that were being recorded and passed down. Now the question would be, Rich, why do you think that? It's a great question. Here's why. Number one, we see this a lot in the Bible. I just pulled 2 examples from our study in Kings. You probably haven't even thought about our study in Kings in a bit, but here's what we read in 1 Kings 11. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did in his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? The writer of Kings had these various historical materials that he was using, writing the book of 1 Kings. All of those historical references have been lost to time. We still have the book of 1 Kings, but it references some of those. So we should not be surprised that writers use historical references to write. They definitely did in the book of Kings multiple times. I'll give you one more and we'll leave the point. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. Now that's not 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That came much later. This was again more historical record that the writer of Kings had that he was using to write this entire story of 1 Kings. So we should not be surprised if Moses, when he wrote the book of Genesis, had a mixture of written record, oral tradition, and divinely revealed things from Yahweh, his God, who was speaking to him as you speak to a man face to face. And I believe that's what we had. But it's more than just that. It's more than good examples from the book of 1 Kings. Within Genesis, I think there's a hint that this is going on. And it's the Hebrew phrase toledoth. By the way, I've uploaded a document to our website if you want to take a look at it, called The Genesis of Genesis. It really walks you through all the uses of this phrase, this Hebrew word toledoth, again, which means generations or history. I believe these are the markers of each section that Moses had that he created. So as you start walking through them, the first one is described this way. These are the generations, the toledoth, of the heaven and the earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh, God, made the heavens and the earth. This is a section that no man saw. This is a section that God either revealed directly to Adam and it began to be passed down, or he revealed directly to Moses. Because let's be honest, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. None of us were there to see it. Nobody was there to see it. We would not know it unless God revealed it. It is interesting that the first use of Toledoth, no man's name attached to it, it's the Toledoth of the history of creation. The next one, Genesis 5:1, this is the Toledoth of Adam, the history of Adam. It's like a subscript. After it gives us Adam and everything that's going on, it says this is the history of Adam when God created man. I believe those two sections, between 2:4 and 5:1, about Adam, written by Adam, passed down. Moses would collect those, collate them together, and they would become part of the book of Genesis. Now, could it all be oral tradition? Yes. Could it all be divine revelation? Yes. Could it all be passed down? No, because some of it was divine revelation. So again, I think we have all three, but that's how we get the book, I believe, that we refer to as Genesis. Let's see if there's anything else that I want to talk about. So it's really referring to the history of man. Okay, the location. Oh, by the way, let's talk about arrangement real quick before we talk about location. So the arrangement is really twofold. The simple arrangement is Genesis 1 through 11, what we would call pre-Abrahamic history. Just so you know, this section, Genesis 1 through 11, is the section that modern scholars attack as not being literal history. This is the section that contains creation. This is the section that contains the flood. This is a section that modern scholars and some Christians attack as not being literal history, but being spiritual teachings. That's code for there's spiritual truth you can get out of this, but it really didn't happen like this. It's not literal history. That's not the position I take. I take that Genesis 1 through 50 are literal history. And I think there's plenty of evidence to build that case. But understand, there are scholars who believe that Genesis 1 through 11 are a legend. I don't want to call them myth because they would never call them myth. But they're not literally true. But they teach spiritual truths. That's what they would say. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Okay.
Who are these scholars that are attesting to this creation of the Bible in that way? I mean, how do
it's definitely a modern thought. In fact, Mike and I were just talking about it right before class, and there are scholars who see this, as Mike's example that he brought up from one scholar, they see it as a poem. So they don't see it as historical narrative, they see it as a poetry. So it's teaching you grand truths, but it's not literal. And it's modern, it's really a modern idea. It's not something that you will dig up in ancient scholarship. It is a very modern thought. And I would argue that it's being influenced by Darwinism. It's people attempting to hold the idea that the earth is 4.5 billion years old, the creation, the cosmos is 13.7 billion years old, and the Bible is still true. And so many of them are trying to find a place where they can coexist. And I would argue, as we're going to walk through Genesis, there is no place. You're not going to find any place where evolutionary thoughts and processes can coexist with Christian thoughts and processes. Everything is different. And we'll get into that soon enough. But now, that sounds rather negative when I say it that way. There are good, godly men who believe this is poetry. They believe it's not literal. And so don't take that everyone who believes it has rejected God. That's not what I mean. There are good people who would say that's not literal history. That's just not my position. And James has a question.
My dad would be one of them. I was raised in the Episcopal Church.
Okay, see, this is perfect.
And he loved the Lord.
Yep.
And you'd say, Dad, we all came from Adam and Eve. And he'd say, it's poetry. Sort of. And the church diverged there. And what was able to creep in is, as soon as it's poetry, we're off the reservation on God's plan right there. But so anyway, a lot of good churches,
absolutely,
that teaching that.
And so within Genesis, back to the arrangement, again, we see the first 11 chapters, pre-Abrahamic history, chapter 12 to 50, all post-Abraham and after history. For the scholars who doubt 1 through 11, they generally hold that 12 through 50 are literal history. For Rich, it's all literal history, and we'll talk about that soon enough. Was there a question, Tim?
It's always been the same lie. Did God really say?
Did God really say? And we'll talk about that soon enough. Okay, so what about the location? Let's get back to it. So the location is the Middle East. It's the near Middle East. We're very familiar with where all this happened, right? We're familiar with the Tigris, the Assyria, Babylon, the fact that Abraham was called out of Ur of Chaldees. We're familiar with all this. I would just say this. When we look at a map like this is after the flood. This is after the global catastrophe that covered the water across the entire face of the earth, that created the mountain ranges we now see, that placed fossilized animals on top of those mountains we now see. This was after the catastrophe of the flood. We're talking about geography as we understand it today. Fair enough? It would have been much different post-flood. But we'll talk about the flood soon enough, beginning in Genesis 5. But that's the location. So that you know, and again, we've sort of cracked open this. Liberal scholars doubt Genesis 1 through 11. In Matthew 23, Jesus is chiding the scribes and Pharisees because of their unbelief. He was good at that because they were good at that. Here's what he says. So that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. We'll stop there for a moment. Who was Abel? Adam's son, Cain's brother, Seth's brother, right? Seth's the later one born. Now, wait a minute. So Jesus is going to require the blood of a man who really never lived. This is a legend. This is a myth. And Jesus is looking at that generation, and he said, God is going to require the blood of righteous Abel, a guy who never lived, who's not true, it's just a myth, at your hands. I don't think so, y'all. Jesus, God, thinks that Abel was a real person. And that he was righteous. So obviously, it seems to me, as I think about that, Abel's real. In referring to his return, Jesus said this. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the return of the Son of Man. So he goes, go read Genesis 5 and all that was going down, just like it was then, so shall it be at the Lord's return. Now wait a minute. If that really didn't happen, if Noah wasn't a real person, if this was just a spiritual story to teach me spiritual truths, but it's not literal history, why would Jesus say the way it was then is how it's going to be when I come back? I would argue because it's literal history. In the days of Noah, Noah was a literal man who lived in a literal time, and it became literally evil, and God sent a flood on the literal earth. And if you think I'm kidding, and if you think that's just Rich's position, let's go on reading Jesus as he continues this discussion. They, referring to the people during Noah's day, were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the imaginary ark. No. The day when Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed 3 of them. All of them. I would argue that Jesus' position on Genesis 1 through 11 were literal history, literal people, and he referred to them as such. Now, at this point, either Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, that's off the table. He's God in the flesh. He's lying. He's tricking us. He wants us to believe it's literal when it's not literal. No, God doesn't lie. That's off the table. There's only one conclusion left here. Genesis 1 through 11, in Rich's humble opinion, and again, I love you if you disagree, but in Rich's opinion, they're literal history. And we can trust everything we learn from Genesis 1 through 11. Let's see, anything else? Another interesting thing that happens in Genesis is we come across many names of God. Now, what's cool is you know many songs that are based on one of those names. I mean, people have written songs about just one name, and the book of Genesis is loaded with different titles and with different names of God. Now, because I found this fascinating, I created 10 names of God in Genesis. There's many more than 10. I just grabbed 10 and put them up. It's uploaded to the website. You can go grab it if you like. But I do want to talk about just 2. The first one is, in the beginning, God. That Hebrew word is Elohim. Now, if you're already pre-reading and you're reading before I'm talking, you're already starting to take in that Hebrew word is in the plural form. It has the im, the I-M ending, and it would normally be translated gods. So you're probably thinking, then why isn't it translated gods? Because it has a singular verb. The verb is singular, the name is plural. I would argue with you that although the Jews didn't see it, and of course we wouldn't have seen it either, already in Genesis 1:1, they were already being exposed not to just simply the majesty of God, which He is majestic, the uniplurality of His person. Now, that would not be revealed for thousands of years. That would not be revealed into the New Testament. That would not be really panned out, that God is a triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, until the New Testament. But I would argue throughout the Old Testament, and not just here, we're going to see other places, God was already indicating the multiplicity of His nature, although He is one God. And they just didn't see it, and guess what? We would not have seen it either. But it was there, and in hindsight, in retrospect, we can see it. But one more name before we get off this point, and it's because I like it so much. In Genesis 16:3, Hagar, who's running from her master, refers to God as El Roi. El being God, the God who sees. Now, I'll be honest with y'all. You know, if you're in sin, that should come as like a serious wake-up call. God sees it. God knows it. There's no secrets. There's no secret closet. There's no secret room. There's no secret place. But let's be honest. If you're walking with God, if you're suffering persecution, if you're enduring things at the hands of other people, if you're being mishandled, wrongly treated, if things are against you rather than for you, can I tell you something? God sees it. Your Father knows it. He is El Roi. And so I would argue when you find yourself where you're being persecuted, where you're being mistreated, where you're being mishandled, remember, your Father sees and He knows.
Chuck Missler says, a grandson asks his grandkid, does God watch me all the time? Is He just looking at me all the time? And the granddad answered, yes. He loves you so much He can't take His eyes off of you.
And what a beautiful reminder. God sees us. God sees us. And that's very comforting and reassuring to me personally. So that's why I grabbed that one out of the 10. Okay, number next, though, as you think about this, there's a grander point I want you to catch. Throughout the book of Genesis, God is doing one thing, and that's doing everything He can to make Himself known. The God who would not be known any other way. We could speculate. We could look at the skies and say, wow, He must be an awesome God. He must be a powerful God. He must be an incredible God. He must be a creative God. We could speculate. But throughout Genesis, what we see from the very jump is God is trying to reveal Himself to men and women. He's trying to make Himself known. And that's an amazing lesson. Not only is He the all-powerful God, He is the God who's making Himself known. And that brings us to another category, and that's the genealogies of Genesis. And by the way, I promise we'll get out of the introduction. I created this document so that you would have it. It's uploaded to the webpage. It lists each of the fathers, when their son was born, their son's name. Is there evidence that that was their son? In other words, it wasn't a great-great-grandson or something like that. The year since creation when the son was born, how old the father was when he died, the year since creation when the father died, and then the references that where Rich culled this all together. So you can see the history going on, whether you're looking at who gave birth to who and when, or when that was since the creation. However you want to track it, you can find it that way, and that's why I created it that way. As you look at Genesis, what you're looking at is less than 2,400 years of history. Now, I say that like it's a small number, less than 24. There's no other book where we're looking at 2,400 years of history, y'all. Nothing even close. In these 11 chapters, we have a massive amount of history that's being ran by very fast. But the entire book, about 2,400 years. Again, we will use this chart many times. I'm not the creator, the author of this chart, but I love it because it says things very clearly. I just want to show you a couple things, and we're going to leave this topic of genealogies and move on. I want you to see that it's interesting of all the overlap that was going on. Look how God wound down the generations at the flood. No one died in the flood. Methuselah probably died the moment right before the flood came. Take a look at his name. But no one else, Enoch was taken out, Lamech died early. No one died because of the flood, and Noah and his family went through the flood. Amazing to me. You see, the flood occurred 1656 years after creation. Again, that requires Genesis, if you believe Genesis 1 through 11 to be literal history. You can see that Noah, who went through the flood, a patriarch who started pre-flood, went through the flood, he is the last guy to live over 900 years. 950 to be exact. Something changed at the flood. It changed in a way where lifespans began to decrease and began to decrease rapidly. So when we get to Genesis 5, 6, 7, and 8, we're talking about the flood. You need to keep this picture in your back of your mind. It's not just a rainstorm, y'all. Something happened on this planet where the lives of men began to drop off drastically to the area where we have now. And you can see that in Joseph living 110 years. So again, a lot of things here we'll talk about as we go. Yes, James?
Anything significant about Enoch's life being so short?
So I'll just say this. My dad and I talked about this topic for a whole lot more time than I would rather dedicate to it. Here's what we know from the Bible. Enoch walked with God, and all that means. It's a very positive statement. And he was not, for God took him. My dad said, yeah, but why don't we have something written by Enoch? Why? Deuteronomy 23:23. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. I don't know why. We just simply don't. And then he talked about the book of Enoch, and that's a whole nother discussion, but that was written much later. There's no doubt about it. So, James, I hope that answered your question. He was a godly man who walked with God, and God took him. That's all I got for you. That's all I got for you, brother. Okay, great question. Thank you. Again, this is not currently loaded up on our site in the miscellaneous documents. I'll get this uploaded today in case you want to download this. I love this document. It is my favorite. I'm not the genesis of that document. Okay. Another picture of it. Okay, lastly, before we leave and get on to our lesson, Tim and I had talked about this. I went and grabbed 10 anticipations, 10 of those things, disasters in Genesis that are reversed in the Revelation. And you can see this is the document that's uploaded. If you go to our webpage, you can take a look at it. I only did 10. There are, of course, many more. I was just trying to get you started and sort of prime your pump if you're interested in that. I will give you 2. In Genesis 3:19, death enters the world, a world that had not known death. By the way, y'all, if this earth is millions and billions of years old and it's been going like this a long time before Adam, then death reigned long before sin. And I would argue that is completely unbiblical. We have animals dying, we have people dying, we have things dying. In fact, death is bringing forth life for millions of years. Fish are dying, then monkeys come on the scene and they're dying, everything's dying, and then finally we get to Adam when God creates Adam. No. Death is a result of Adam's sin. I would argue Genesis is explaining what's really going on. But it's there, death becomes a reality. It's in Revelation 21:4 that death is eliminated. There will be no more death. The ground is cursed in 3:17. It's in Revelation 22:3 that the curse is removed. There will be no curse. And so that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. And again, I cut a lot of this short by giving you the documents if some of those things we talked about interest you. Any questions before we actually hit the text and now begin the work of working verse by verse through Genesis? Yeah, and Mike looked at his watch and said, hey, good job, Rich. That only took like 50 minutes. Yes, John?
When they say years, are they talking about the same years that we think of a year now?
Great question. So we're going to come to that. So remember, I told you I could answer this however I wanted, but I want to give you a short answer in case we don't get to it today. It's scheduled on my plate to get to today, but I'm looking at my time, Mike, and I may not make it. Yes. Again, as we think about a day, I will quiz you. What is a day? 24 hours. But what is a day? A rotation of the planet Earth as observed from somewhere on the planet Earth, from that position back to that position. That's a day. What that means, if you were on some other planet, what would your day be? Who knows? It wouldn't be our day. Equally, John, and we're going to see this, and so I don't want to bury the lead, so I want to say it. The Hebrew word yom, most of the time when it's used in the Old Testament, means a literal day. But not always. It's like our word day. It doesn't always mean a literal day. The context is important. But anytime, every time, morning or evening are used with day in the Hebrew Bible, it always means a 24-hour day. Go search it. Go to your computer. Go look at it. If morning or evening are used with yom, it always means a literal day. If night is used with yom, in every other occurrence, it always means a literal day. If a cardinal number is used with yom, 1, 2, 3, 4, it always means a literal day. I would argue, and we'll see this soon enough, probably not today, but now I'll get to talk about it again next week. I would argue that Moses, which all scripture is given by inspiration of God, is God-breathed, God is doing everything he can in the Hebrew to tell us that the days that we see in the creation week are literal days. Equally, and then I'll get off of this. John, thank you for asking the question. In Exodus, when the giving of the law happens, we are told because God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, we are to work 6 days and rest on the seventh day. Now that doesn't make any sense if it's not literal days. If it was like each day was 1,000 years or 100,000 years or some unspecified period of time, then that whole statement breaks down. But that statement stands as clear revelation if indeed God created in 6 days as a pattern for how the nation of Israel was to worship. And as you heard our pastor, it would continue as a pattern, even though we no longer meet on the Sabbath, it would continue as a pattern for man throughout time. And so, John, hopefully, I hope that answered your question, at least Rich's position. Yes, Mike. Mike.
So totally tracking with you. But if God didn't create the sun until the fourth day, how did we have that rotating of the earth and the 24-hour day that we're thinking about?
Great question.
For those first 4 days.
No, it's a great question. So what Mike is alluding to is, as we follow the creation story, the sun and the stars were not created until day 4. By the way, not to bury the lead here, and you guys are going to cause me not to get to the book, but that's okay, so we're going to talk about the Bible. So that's fine. By the way, in the evolution story, the stars were created first. Then billions of years later, our star was created. Then hundreds of millions of years later, our earth was created. You cannot get that, y'all, to line up with the creation story. That's a different story, and we must be honest about it. The creation story has the heavens, plural. We'll talk about that maybe next week. It's verse 1. And the earth created day 1. Now to answer Mike's question. On day 1, God created light. That light was more than likely an illumination of God himself. If you doubt that to be so, let me see if I can get there quickly. Let me get through all these verses and just get there quickly. I'm not going to get there quickly. Okay. We'll look at it when we get to Revelation. I can't quote it out of my head. But in Revelation, I think it's 21, we're told that there will be no sun and there will be no moon. Why? Because God is the light. And I would argue that on day 1, the planet was rotating and God was the light. And the 24-hour day was tracking. We know the planet was more than likely rotating. No one thinks the planet wasn't rotating. And God was indeed the light, and he would serve the light for the first 3 days until he created our sun, which would be our ultimate light until when? Until the final day, when he once again becomes the light. I hope that answered your question. 3 days. So hopefully that answered your question. Linda has a question.
I don't have a
Oh,
question.
Linda has a statement.
Well, I would like to just say that it is Deuteronomy 29:29.
Oh, I misquoted. Thank you, sister. Thank you. It is 29:20.
And that's said lovingly.
No, and please rebuke me at any time when I quote a verse and give it a wrong address. But it is Deuteronomy 29:29. Thank you for that, sister. Yeah, brother.
When it says that he separated the light from the dark, is that the beginning of time?
I do believe it is, and here's what I'm going to tell you. We haven't got there yet, so I'm sort of talking before we get to the verse, and then we're going to go to the verse after this. I believe right there on day one, we see the beginning of matter. Didn't exist till then. We see the beginning of energy. It didn't exist till then. We see the beginning of time. It didn't exist until then. And we may even, either day one or day four, the beginning of space. When, as the rest of the Old Testament tells us, God stretched out the heavens. 17 times in the Old Testament tells us that. So whether space was created on day one or day four, I'm not positive, and I'll let anyone else make that decision for me. But I believe time, energy, and matter were created right then. And this is something then you could say, okay, well, the Big Bang, we have that in common. Matter, energy, and time all came into being right then. So we agree at one point. At every other point, we disagree. We believe the agency was God. They believe the agency was the fact that this dot beside the proton just exploded for no reason. And my mic is gone again. But let's get to our text this morning so that we at least read it and you at least begin to ponder it as we unpack it in the coming weeks. Okay. I want you to look at the repetitiveness as we hit it. Some things are going to jump out at you. It was good, after its kind, and the continual use of the Hebrew word plural, Elohim, all with singular verbs, making it translate singular. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness He called night. There was evening, there was morning, the first day. Verse 6. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from waters." And God made the expanse that separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. God called this expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Verse 9. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together He called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, the third day. Verse 14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate day from night. And let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. Oh, and by the way, He made the stars also. Verse 17. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, the fourth day. Verse 20. God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of heavens." My mind cannot fathom what processes came into place to take this water, and all of a sudden it begins to swarm with living creatures. What did that even look like? What processes were required that God executed to take this water and all of a sudden fill it with life? That's what you should have in your mind right now, that our all-powerful God did in a moment. He spoke it. God said. Verse 21, so God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, every winged bird according to its kind. God saw that it was good. God blessed them. He said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters in the sea, let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. Verse 24. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures. What did that look like? What processes were in play that caused the earth to bring forth living creatures. You see, we read this stuff and our mind doesn't pause long enough to go, what did that look like? What processes were in play? Because I'll be honest with you, as we look at the creation stories, we look at these early chapters in Genesis, we see an amazing, all-powerful God doing amazing, powerful things. And here he is. The earth is bringing forth living creatures according to its kind, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kind. And it was so. Verse 25, God made the beasts of the earth according to their kind, the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us, another hidden away, tucked away reminder of the uniplurality of God, even though it's not fully revealed yet. Let us, and I've lost my place, y'all. So God, okay, I should have took my eyes off of it. God said, let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. By the way, you want to know the genesis for the sexes? God. God invented men and women. He could have invented 10 different things. He invented 2. Just a passing note. So God made man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heaven, over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. We'll talk more about that later. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that is the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. We'll talk about that later. And it was so, verse 31, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it's not just good now, y'all. It's exceeding good. It's very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. Thus, the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day. He made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Hallelujah. What did this stuff look like? No, they, thems. He, she's.
And what's your thought about dinosaurs?
So we're going to talk about.
kids
See,
and
didn't I tell y'all? Didn't I tell you as we hit Genesis, everything is on the table?
Yeah, well,
We
I
have
mean,
every-
my kids keep asking me about, well, so how do you explain the dinosaurs? And they're telling us they're millions of years old.
Nope,
And
absolutely not. So the dinosaurs were created during the creation week. The winged dinosaurs, the flying dinosaurs, the swimming dinosaurs, the land dinosaurs on their appropriate days. All the dinosaurs, all life was created during the creation week. We will talk about what happened to the dinosaurs when we get to the flood. We'll talk about the evidence that indicates that's exactly what happened. You should begin to reflect back to the dropping of expected life, man's life. Something drastically changed at the flood. You should begin to ponder, why are all these legends about dragons in all of our different cultures? I would argue because man saw dinosaurs. And then what else do I want to say before I leave this topic? If you look in Job, 2 dinosaurs are named, Behemoth and Leviathan. Leviathan is a seagoing dinosaur with scales that were so tight and so mighty that you couldn't poke a spear in him. Job knew about this guy. Behemoth, God described to Job as this beast who had ribs like bronze and a tail like a cedar tree. Now, there's only one thing that's ever walked on this planet that has a tail like a cedar tree. Only one, a sauropod dinosaur. And so now, let me cut right to the chase, and we'll talk more about this in coming weeks. On the ark were small dinosaurs they would die out shortly after the flood because of the drastic changes that occurred post-flood. That is Rich's position, but we'll talk about that a lot, as well as the evidence when we get there. I hope that answered your question. So, Job, if you just look for Behemoth and Leviathan, and this beautiful blonde woman in the front has a question. Yes, Amy.
Well, you know, in the 15, 16, 1700s, there were a lot of laws of science that were being discovered. There was some real science that was going on. And so there was several hundred years of some real science going on with, you know, the law of gravity and all these different laws that they're discovering. And then here in the 1800s is this guy said he's a scientist, Darwin, and people go, oh, yeah, we believe him. And then there were some geologists that also said, oh, we're scientists.
Charles
And
Lyell.
they make all these statements that we think, oh, this is scientific. Until you look at it specifically, you realize it's not really scientific. So just keep in mind, that's our background as a group of people here, that we had followed what they say was science, which you can, you know, a lot of that is very verifiable, but not all this latter stuff that came a couple hundred years ago.
So we're getting off the beaten path, but I'll beat it down just a little further, and then we'll get back on the path. Keep in mind, as you think about Darwinism, as you think about evolution, evolution is only possible once you have a living, replicating cell. Evolution means nothing. It's just a word without a living, replicating cell. So let's just set that aside for the moment. Where did the living, replicating cell come from? How did life come out of non-living materials and chemicals? I would argue there's only one way. A God who existed outside time stepped into time and created life. 5 minutes? Oh, one more question.
Sorry. Just real quick, this is off the topic totally, but before I forget, I've got 2 tickets to the Sound of Freedom if anybody wants to go.
Okay.
I highly recommend it. I went to see it with a friend and other people couldn't go. So if anybody wants to go, I've got 2 tickets. Now, she took the stub off, but she told me we could use them another day. So,
Okay. Okay.
just
Perfect. Thank you. So everyone, 2 tickets to the Sound of Freedom. I haven't seen it, but I heard it is awesome. You will want to see it. Okay, so let's get at it. We've got 5 minutes, y'all. I should be able to cover chapter. Oh, we got 4 minutes. In the beginning, we'll just stop there. It's a good place to stop. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so let's talk about this. As we think about this, obviously many see this as the grand declaration of scriptures, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course it is that, Jack. It is a grand declaration. But it's more than that. He's already beginning to describe what he did on day 1. It's not just an overarching statement that in the beginning, of course he did, but this is a very specific statement that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit began to hover, began to flutter over the face of the waters. You see what's happening is day 1 is being espoused to us. So sometimes we grab this first one and we miss that, yeah, it's a grand reality, but more specifically, it's what is going on at day 1. So Sandy said the heavens is the atmosphere. We're going to talk about the heavens and what it possibly meant. By the way, you'll notice that it is in the plural. It's in the plural in the Hebrew. We'll talk more about that. Yes, Steve.
Well, it says, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But then it says the earth was without form and void.
Tohu vabohu. Unformed.
And what is the deep?
The waters.
Are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
And
So
darkness was over the face of the deep.
We have no light giver. He's not created light yet. What you should have in your mind is a water-covered globe in space, spinning, and the Spirit of God is hovering over it. God is about to say, let there be light. But right now, this planet, as described, and you jumped in front of me, so we're just going to jump. I'm going to jump with him. Tohu vabohu, it's unformed and unfilled. It's unfinished and unpopulated. It's unframed and undone. There's no life here. It's a planet covered by water in the dark.
Created by God.
Created by God. And guess what is about to happen? He is about to supernaturally bring land out of the water. He's about to supernaturally bring vegetation out of the land. He's about to supernaturally populate the air with life, populate the seas with life, and then populate the planet with living creatures. What you have, though, in this moment is this unformed, unfilled, not yet done earth. And that's all he's telling us. It's tohu vabohu, unformed and unfinished, unframed and unfilled. And that's all he's saying. And darkness is over the face of the deep. This word deep is used repetitively for deep water. Like when Moses cracked the rock, the psalmist said the waters flowed out of the deep. It's the idea of the earth being covered by the oceans. Now, I believe we're probably absolutely out of time. So, just know that Rich did make Genesis 1, verse 1, 1a, in the beginning. But we haven't even talked about what beginning. Whose beginning? We're just getting started on the beginning. I would apologize for spending so much time to get here, but we've been talking about the Word of God all the way here. We've been trying to put our minds around what is one of the greatest books ever imagined by the mind of man, as God moved a man to write it. Let's pray.